huge thanks as well to all of the organisers for very generous and kind invitation. It's a real honour to be part of the celebration event and this beautiful project, one which has brought immense joy, I think, to so many students and staff as well. So on behalf, I think, of everyone in the profession, we owe you a big round of applause and huge sense of gratitude. So what I would like to do today is something which is slightly unusual in terms of the kind of typical academic talk, but then again, that should be consistent with the theme of the conference, which is to provide a sense of my own personal reflections on the activities, particularly the operational activities of actually co-creation with students. Because this is something which I've never done before in academia. It's something which is almost rarely talked about and discussed in academia, the actual idea of co-creation with students. You have ideas about consulting with students, hearing the student voice, listening to the student voice. But the idea of co-creation is something which is totally different. And without obviously wanting to shamelessly plug my own institution, is something which is unique at SOAS. So I'm very, very proud of that fact that SOAS is a champion for co-creation. And then what I'll do is I'll provide an argument ultimately about diagnosing hostility towards co-creation. Why are some folks hostile to the activities of co-creation? Why is co-creation seen as something that is a threat to status quo arrangements? And precisely for that reason, why it should be embraced and nurtured and treasured. So to begin with, in terms of laying the groundwork, then obviously in the toolkit, we discussed this at length, and then in the handbook version, which was the kind of more scholarly infused, slightly crazily 80-page long document, which we're going to convert into a book, which will be authored by my colleagues and the student interns themselves. Just before I continue, I want to shout out to my colleagues and student interns. It was very much a group effort. The student interns are some of the most extraordinary talents I've ever come across. To actually engage in co-creative activity and produce the kinds of things that they did, especially when many of them had not even finished their BAs, is truly remarkable intellectual achievement. And they can be very proud that their work is now featured as a key resource in the Quality Assurance Agency subject benchmark statement for philosophy. So that means a lot in terms of how they can actually impacted already at sector. So on with the show in terms of thinking about the actual logic behind challenging colonialities within the Greater North philosophy provision. I think it goes without saying, and I don't need to preface this with too much of an argument, I'll say at least a persuasive one, is that much of global North and Euro-American philosophy more generally is structurally antagonistic to a philosophy that isn't white, cis, male, heterosexual. But the key reason, I think, what underpins that kind of structural antagonism, kind of what binds together the different threads of classism, ableism, neurotypicalism, and of course racism as well, and misogyny, is what sadly dearly departed Ngũgĩ, the brilliant Kenyan theorist, called colonial alienation, which he developed at length in the collection Decolonising, published in 1987. And Ngũgĩ uses this expression very vividly throughout his work. And it's nicely encapsulated by the following remarks here, which I'm going to put in kind of constructive philosophical dialogue to a sociological point with Anibal Kifani, the Peruvian sociologist who coined the expression the coloniality of power. Okay? So colonial alienation is the alienation, quite reinforced in the teaching of history, geography, music, where bourgeois Europe was always the center of the universe. So in a way, colonial alienation is a direct logical effect, as well as the phenomenological effect, of Eurocentrism. But the particular point about the idea of Europe as the center of the universe is more so that there are not just simply dynamics of silencing and systematic exclusion and even erasure of certain kinds of discourse. But it reproduces a particular kind of discursive effective architecture, which is encapsulated by the work of Fanon when he talks about how colonialism has produced crippling inferiority complexes within the colonized subjects themselves. Where the risk ultimately of colonial alienation is not just simply the normalization of a crippling inferiority complex, but it relates to something that Cora Diamond has written about, though obviously she doesn't mention coloniality at all in her 1988 paper, Losing Your Concepts, which personally I think is one of the best papers ever written. I'm actually obsessed with this paper. Ask any of my students, I mention it pretty much in any seminar, any lecture I give. But the crucial point is that what the effect of colonialization results in is the ultimate loss of concepts. It leads to the permanent erasure from discursive architecture, the ability to produce indigenous vocabularies, local and minor knowledges, which naturally resist the particular grammars and hermeneutic constellations of, say, Anglo-European, Euro-American vocabularies and the like. So that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a situation in which there is a real threat of the loss of concepts, the loss of life worlds produced by placing Europe at the center of the universe. So what I want to do is detail those critical pedagogical logics behind the development of the Decolonising Toolkit and Handbook project, and then talk about the nitty-gritty side of things, operational side of what actually you need to do to establish good co-creation activities. And one of the things that I'm very interested in doing is also challenging the idea that the Decolonising Toolkit and Handbook can be easily called exercises in diversification. Because I don't think they're exercises in diversification, they're exercises in decoloniality itself. I think that diversification is kind of sub-branch. That's not to say it's epistemically less serious, logically inferior to practices of decoloniality, but it is first and foremost an exercise in delinking oneself from contexts, traditions, assessment cultures, crucially, which reproduce marginalizing systems of knowledge themselves. So it's very much a kind of convulsive activity. The worry is that the classification of it purely as a diversification output produces a type of mess. So, Simon, you mentioned Charles Mills. Charles Mills is back in that form in terms of the activity. And then with regards to the second point, as I said earlier, about construing hostility towards co-creation as a particular kind of deep-seated epistemic and even professional insecurity. There's nothing quite like relinquishing power, and it's actually quite a lot of fun. And I always encourage colleagues to do it. You feel a lot better. That's not because you get to sit and have a kind of smoke in the room while the students are doing the work themselves, but you witness something which is very rare to find in contemporary neoliberal environments, which is joy. That's an argument that effectively want to give, is that co-creation enables cultures of joy. And the world needs joy. But now, particularly more than that. So, joyful practice is the way forward. So, in terms of thinking about, like I said, the kind of intellectual origins behind the project, part of what we were all trying to do at SOAS was trying to think about the legacies of modernity, whereas obviously modernity is such a long term, different ways of explaining where modernity begins. It does begin with the Reformation, it does begin with the Renaissance, it does begin with the scientific revolution. But there is something particularly interesting, I think, even at a kind of psychoanalytic level, when you look at Francis Bacon's Novum Organum and this publication in 1620, because it gives you a vocabulary for thinking about, to use this wonderful expression by the intellectual historian Giladi, that Bacon tries to inaugurate an epistemological empire in the development of the inductive method. And what's interesting about looking at the history of natural science, at least in the Anglo-European canon, is that it's not just useful as a tool for getting things right. It's not just simply a tool that is useful for representational purposes, in terms of how you can kind of model reality nicely structured, almost in exact accordance with the Wittgensteinian, at least early Wittgensteinian idea of that kind of logical isomorphism between fact and proposition. It's more than just simply getting things right. It's also a way of producing a vision for how reality is ultimately constituted and how society should be governed by reason. And this is where this idea of this epistemological empire as a basis for European identity comes into the picture. Because what you find, and this is the kind of first part of the argument here, is that Bacon provides effectively in the novel organism the first exposition of coloniality, the first exposition of how you can drive the motor for the colonization of territory, land, labor, and life by first thinking of inquiry as rooted in the kind of mastery of nature itself. And it's very interesting. SOAS's motto is knowledge is power, which is very curious. The thing like, okay, are we playfully playing with Bacon, or is there something really dark? So SOAS's origins as an instrument of empire. But the interesting thing about this is the sense of in which, when I mentioned about the kind of psychoanalytic point, this is whenever I've chatted about this with students in the part of the lectures that I give in comparative metaphysics, there's this kind of awkward silence when I say to them, did you ever think that maybe part of the reason why we developed natural science is as a way of reclaiming authority over nature that we had before the fall? And there's this kind of hush. Whoa, did he just say that? Well, it's a very interesting idea because Bacon says in many occasions that what happened in the fall was our loss of control over the dominion of nature. So our attempt to bring nature before the tribunal of reason and scientific methods is almost an attempt at reclaiming epistemic authority. You pulverize nature into submission through, for example, using that very visceral Platonic metaphor in the Phaedrus, by carving nature at its joints. But carving nature at its joints is not a norm-free, purely cognitive activity. It's a cognitive activity rooted in coloniality. It's about categorization, systematic ordering, exclusion, and ultimately it sets up what contemporary analytic philosophers call the placement problem, which is how do you place normative phenomena in the world described by natural sciences? And the very idea of a category is itself a problem, because that leads to fundamental forms of exclusion and erasure of difference. So effectively, the point that what we're trying to work on is the idea that metaphysics should never be thought of as this discipline of, the Aristotelian attempt to uncover the structure of being qua being. Metaphysics is drenched in power. And there's nothing wrong with that, per se, because you can have productive power relations as well as unproductive or punitive power relations. But metaphysics is anything but a norm-free essence. Same thing as well with epistemology. It's not this 0-point standpoint where you're looking norm-free, genderless, unracialized, unsexualized. You are invested, thrown into the world in so many different kinds of ways. So I want to read out this passage from Walter Mignolo, who is one of the kind of leading members of the Latinx school of decoloniality, along with folks like Maria Briones. And the Latinx school of decoloniality introduces this idea of coloniality as what logically precedes the development of colonization itself. So if you ask ChatGPT to kind of explain the difference between coloniality and colonialism, it will do a fairly decent job. It's still fairly superficial. But there is an important difference between the two, because what coloniality involves is basically the development of the modern impetus at controlling nature. And the idea is that if you can control nature, you can control territory. You can control one territory, you can see if you can extend it to other territories as well. And then Bernardo de Sousa Santos also, as we know, has used the expression epistemicide, which is very, very, again, visceral expression, but it concerns the ways in which that this development of coloniality as the unfolding of a type of ethno-nationalist supremacy, starting from the Renaissance, moving through particularly the age of scientific revolutions, and then development, of course, of scientific racisms. Coloniality is ultimately designed to create a situation in which you have what I felt foregrounded earlier with Coradon, that permanent loss of concepts, where epistemicide is the death of knowledge systems, the permanent death. There's no, Super Mario 1-up to resurrect these knowledge systems. They're dead and they are forever dead. And that's the kind of tragedy that we're having to confront. And why is coloniality so important? Is because it doesn't die with the development of the post-colonial or decolonial nation state. That's the crucial difference, is that the way in which coloniality persists is that even after you have expelled colonial administrators from territory, even though you are emerging from the ashes of empire, what has coloniality produced by being constitutive of Western European modernity? That little C word, capitalism. So, if coloniality lingers on by producing geo-capitalist political and economic orders, modernity is in a state of constant crisis. And we see this playing out now. So what's the interesting thing then about decoloniality is that it links to what Mignolo riffs on from Aníbal Quijano, who he takes as a great inspiration. And what I would say the kind of key message of decoloniality is, it's this idea of delinking from coloniality itself. It's being epistemically disobedient, to use his expression. Now, why does it matter about being epistemically disobedient in the sense of refusing to play the games of, say, liberal practices of inclusion or performative box-ticking activities, but rather what you want to do is, say, engage in a model of inquiry which is genuinely global orientated. It's not oscillating within the psychodramas of European thought. Take, for example, as one typical psychodrama that you always find is very exciting. It is at a level of critical theory. It kind of is tiresome. The Foucault Habermas. It's interesting, sure, but there's a kind of reality ultimately to the conversation, because there is a wide range of discourse that aims to go precisely beyond the oscillation between modernity and post-modernity, which is developed by liberation theologists such as Enrique Dussel, who use the expression transmodernity, where you precisely move beyond the discourses of modernity, post-modernity, truth, and post-truth. So what you do in being epistemically disobedient is that you try ultimately to articulate a model of inquiry which is horizontal, comparative, and inherently dialogical. And it aims at decentering any kind of particular tradition. So the curiosity is, say, for example, if you have two different types of centrism, such as Afrocentrism, say, and then Eurocentrism. Very different notions of centrism there. Afrocentrism was not saying African philosophy is superior to all types of discourses and everything needs to be structured around African interests, African cosmology, etc. Far from it. It's more the sense that what you're doing by decentering is that you are foregoing any sense that one particular global tradition has a type of privileged access to knowledge over others. So rather than having that kind of situation where a typical first-year undergraduate in the UK or American philosophy program will say, but which one's right? Like, that's not the question you should be asking. The question rather you should be asking is, what do you learn by putting, say, Kantian approaches to normativity into direct conversation with Ubuntu or Zulu traditions concerning moral responsibility. How do you make sense of intersubjectivity from a Fichtian, Hegelian, Levinasian, Logstropian, Ubuntu, and also feminist anarchist Chinese position? So that's the kind of orientation you're thinking that you're trying to articulate. Equally, when you're thinking about how to develop, say, transnational feminist discourses, rather than thinking about the feminist movement as a distinctively Western European contribution to women's liberation, you think about how you can pool resources from Latinx, Caribbean, Middle Eastern, particularly Islamic feminism. So it's very much a kind of almost cross-permeable, borderless types, which is far more adept at cultivating relationships of solidarity across national borders. So this type of activity of redirecting the flow of epistemic power away from a type of privileging of Europe and then fixing Africa, Asia, and Middle East onto it, say, this direction of the redirection of the flow of epistemic power is a joyful activity. It's joyful also because what you find yourself invariably doing is seeing lived experience, cultural specificity, and positionality as the crucibles in which knowledge is formed. So rather than thinking of lived experience as something which is a barrier to objectivity, rather it's precisely that objectivity is rooted in lived experience. Because the notion of objectivity you have to work with is not one that is attaining a type of God's-eye perspective or view from nowhere discourse, but rather what we really mean by objectivity is historically centered, culturally specific, reflective consciousness. And this idea of a developing an alternative to modernity, so a pluriversal mode of thinking. If you're interested also in seeing this, how this gets played out in the political sphere, the Zapatista movement is very, very involved in developing pluriversalism, the idea of one world within many, as a way of preserving different life worlds. This idea of developing alternatives to modernity is a type of what you might call positive convulsion in Foucault's sense, where when Foucault talks about the convulsions of modernity, where his particular focus is on marginalized sexualities, and the idea of affirming your love for your partner, despite all attempts in mainstream society to deny the possibility of affirming your love for your partner, that's a type of creative convulsion. You're unshackling yourself from these constraints. So here we come to this really interesting expression from Mignolo and his partner in progressive crime, Catherine Walsh, wonderful indigenous thinker as well. And this is happening there, co-authored a work on decoloniality. They talk about this idea of epistemic reconstitution as its goal. So I'll read that passage here. Decoloniality's goal and orientation are epistemic reconstitution. Epistemic reconstitution cannot be achieved by setting up a new school of thought within Western cosmology. Epistemic reconstitution requires two simultaneous tasks: to open up to the richness of knowledges and praxis of living that the rhetoric of modernity demonizes. So, for example, and this is how I always troll my colleagues in anthropology. I do love my colleagues in anthropology, but I always I have to always have a bit of needle with them. Say, well, you know, the whole primitive, barbarian, civilized discourse. That's exactly the kind of issue that you see how what coloniality has done is that it relegates some knowledge as primitive, some knowledge as advanced, some knowledge is barbaric, some knowledge is civil. Okay. And reduced to tradition, precisely here, barbarism, folklore, underdevelopment, denied spirituality and any reason, and built knowledges to control sexuality and all kinds of barbarians. So a very good way also of thinking about this, if you want to look at it from a kind of post-colonial feminist perspective, particularly with reference to the work by, say, Gayatri Spivak, think about her analysis of subalternity. This idea that, you know, the subaltern class are incapable of speaking because they are only wrapped up in tradition. They can't step outside and engage in critical capacities. But of course, as we know, the key issue is not can subalterns speak, rather than can the subaltern be heard? Because if they're going to be heard, what kinds of dominant epistemic systems will they have to be assimilated in for their speech to actually be registered as intelligible? And that's the kind of double consciousness that they have to experience that. As they continue, second, and necessarily, epistemic reconstitution required delinking from the bubbles of modern thoughts from the left and from the right. So, this is effectively Mignono Morti's way of saying, can we please change the record on the Habermas, Foucault, Deleuze love fest? It's interesting, but there's more to the idea of reason, faith, and knowledge than just these interminable oscillations. And even someone as very intellectually complex as Hegel was kind of onto this point where he talks about the frustrations of these oscillations within a very, very undialectical framework. There is an interesting issue about the extent to which epistemic reconstitution may actually ultimately be taking what the Hegelian dialectical method meant to its ultimate logical conclusion. Really, what you should be doing is precisely trying to sublate all of these distinctions and move beyond those distinctions to create something new that's slightly weird and wonderful. And this leads me on to this crucial bit that was central for the development of the Toolkit project, which is the idea of thinking of epistemic reconstitution as necessary for enabling what Fanon in the conclusion to The Wretched of the Earth talks about as a critical humanism. Now, if any of you don't know this part of The Wretched of the Earth, I urge you to read it. Even take your phone out right now, don't listen to me, start reading it. It's an extraordinary piece of work because it's philosophy mixed with poetry, mixed with almost mystical reflections on the nature of existence itself, where Fanon ultimately comes up with this very interesting and very prophetic line that the new notion of humanity that will need to be written as a way of undoing the damage of colonialism itself will have to be authored, he uses the term the third world, by effectively the global south. So this is what they mean earlier on Walsh and Mignono about moving beyond the European frameworks themselves. The reason for this is because, as Fanon writes here in The Wretched of the Earth capitulation, quote, Europe has denied itself not only humility and modesty, but also solicitude and tenderness. Very beautiful. And this translation of Fanon is actually good, as opposed to the horrible translation of Vécu Noir as, the fact of blackness, which is horrific. This expression of solicitude and tenderness is very, very, very curious because it suggests that ultimately with Fanon, what he's interested in, despite all of the talk of violence as necessary for decolonial upheaval, he's ultimately interested in almost a kind of maternal nurturing discourse, that the job of the global south effectively for reparative work is to provide this kind of tender notion of humanity, which is free from all types of discursive and material forms of violence itself. So there's an interesting way of kind of feminizing Fanon here, which is curious as well, particularly when you look at a lot of African decolonial feminist critiques of Fanon, where they think that he spends far too much time worrying about the colonizer, instead of thinking about what the colonized needs. So that's a very interesting point, which we can talk about later. And then this is the kind of key issue about the revisionary potential. So I'm using revisionary here very much in the kind of Peter Strawson sense of revisionary metaphysics. So you're not content with simply describing the conceptual architecture that human beings have, but rather you're thinking about how you can produce a better conceptual architecture, one more attuned, for example, to the dynamics of solicitude and tenderness. So epistemic reconstitution would involve the germination of a vocabulary for a new concept in politics of humanity, or something which Europe has been incapable of achieving. Okay, so this is kind of what the whole discourse about the reversibilist is. It can't be rooted in European paradigms, even progressive Anglo-European paradigms and Euro-American paradigms like American pragmatism, particularly John Dewey's pragmatism, even that's still constrained by legacies of coloniality. So you have to do another kind of convulsion activity here. So onto the kind of more political side of things. That wasn't very political enough. Why I have beef with diversification instead of decolonization here is because I think that there is a real risk of diversification as not wanting to confront legacies of coloniality. And part of the reason for this is I've noticed is that in some feedback that we had when I was in the advisory group on the QAA subject benchmark statement for philosophy, when we put very carefully just a couple of mentions about the need to decolonize rather than just merely diversify the curriculum, because also crucially by decolonizing what I mean also ways in which you could dismantle at the same time legacies of gender-based exclusion, forms of neurodivergence exclusions as well. One anonymous feedback was they said, "Oh, this is very, very ideological. You know, someone has an axe to grind." And I remember saying to the chair, I said, "Yeah, I do have an axe to grind. If, for example, you're saying treating people with dignity is having an axe to grind, then surely everyone has an axe to grind. I mean, thinking that Africa has a site of knowledge that is useful for transnational philosophical purposes, I didn't realize that was having an axe to grind." So there's a kind of strangeness about thinking that diversity is good, but decolonization, that's risky, that's dangerous, that's political. Well, the idea is that you can't properly diversify if you don't decolonize, and the point about diversification is that just like it's an iterative process, much in the same way that decolonization is an iterative process. There's never a fait accompli with decolonization. They say, okay, we're done. There's certainly none of us at SOAS think, okay, we've produced this handbook and that's it, hashtag complete, level up now to do something else. No, it's the first phase of kind of radical forms of unlearning and relearning in good ways. So the irony also is that thinking about diversification without centering it in relation to decolonization means you're also discursively ill-equipped to recognize the extent to which that very categories of race, gender, and sexuality are themselves legacies of coloniality. So I would always say to someone, read Maria Legonis's 2 essays in Hypatia. Like, you need convincing about this. Because the very idea of saying, well, we're diversifying with respect to gender, race, and sexuality, but we don't engage in decolonial work. So, well, don't we realize that actually gender, race, and sexuality are themselves legacies of coloniality? So if you want to diversify, you have to decolonize at the same time. And it's a brave step. It's not one that you should worry about. Yes, you get flack for it, but you get flack for saying trans women are women when they are women. So it's just people need to not be. They shouldn't be able to hide from what they really think. So in terms of now co-creation, why is this a particularly joyful activity? Well, part of the reason for this is because it comes from the broader tradition of critical pedagogy, which we associate normally with folks like Paulo Freire and bell hooks. Okay, so Paulo Freire is the author of Teaching Pedagogy to Impress, and bell hooks is the author of Teaching to Transgress. And what I think is particularly joyful about the co-creation activity, why it's connected as well to decolonization, is because it's the leveling out of power. The leveling out of power and the sense in which that actually you realize that your training has been so limiting in various ways that actually you are freeing yourself to experiment with ideas, which is exactly what all kind of good humanists do. The beauty about being a humanist, just like, we talk about always play, children enjoying play. So I have, an infant daughter. It's a marvelous sight to see her play. Like, there's no method of, drive to what she does. It's just amazing. Just total madness, but there's joy in the moment. And also, if you have a dog, when you just see a dog doing zoomies, dog's not worrying about, the economy. They're not worrying about power. They're just loving it. They have that pure joy and affect. And with co-creation, it's built also on a key issue, which of course colonialities are trying to sever, which is the kind of priority of trust over distrust. And you see it as well in terms of how students, when you say to them, I want to co-create with you this assessment culture, they initially are struck by that because they think you're trusting me that I'm epistemically and professionally capable of doing this. And you just tell them, yeah, of course you are. You're a university student. You have all these amazing capacities. Do it. You've just been taught, because of the punitive education system, not to trust in your discursive opinions. It's no surprise why you don't even use the first person active singular voice in your work. And you hide, you literally self-silence. Much more in the way that, Christy Dodson has talked about in terms of dynamics of testimonial smothering and the like. You can't even recognize the use of I in your vocabulary. That's truly tragic. Like, who am I as a thinker? So we heard at the lovely introduction at the start, but who is the philosopher? Well, if you don't have a grip of your own identity as a thinker, how can you even claim to be a philosopher? So there's a very serious issue. And the point about why co-creation it matters is because it means that when it comes to kind of the key issue about curriculum design, you're thinking about thematic content. So in terms of what are you actually studying in the curriculum, the reading list, obviously helps there. And learning outcome design, that's a really interesting issue. Because one thing that I've had a lot of fun with students doing is I ask them, do you think understand is a learning outcome action verb? They always say no, so it doesn't mean anything. You say apply, explain, evaluate, use, communicate. So they all automatically think in terms of actions that they can produce. And then the really excellent and fun stuff as well is formative and summative assessment design. Because so much of the discourse that we know about decolonizing the curriculum, ironically, discourse which is not infused by actual research in pedagogy itself, is very content by saying, oh, you have culturally inclusive reading lists, you're golden. The big issue is, and the question that no one really does attend to in significant detail, is assessment. Assessment is the key issue, because you can have the most inclusive, racially, ethnically, culturally inclusive curriculum design, but you can have as your assessment culture something deep traditional. Essays set by the module convener that are ChatGPT vulnerable. For example, you say critically discuss Bell Hooks' argument for intersectionality. Okay, ChatGPT can answer that. Do something more imaginative. You can have the most culturally inclusive curriculum content, but you can have the most almost colonially structured assessment culture. And that is actually what is more responsible for the racialized award gap in the UK, rather than the issue of a white curriculum. So think about it this way, that if your assessment culture is not decolonial, it doesn't matter how culturally inclusive your reading lists are. What matters is doing both at the same time. So the culturally inclusive model involves justice as pedagogy, justice as process, and justice in assessments as well. So assessment for social justice purposes, effectively. So this is the kind of culturally inclusive model that Lambert and all had produced. This is effectively central to the architecture of the project itself. It's central to the architecture of the project itself that we did at SOAS. As we can see here, is that it matters that you have to have this process of co-creation, because co-creation will enable the development also of decolonial assessment practice itself. And it's just huge amounts of fun. losing that sense of control over your assessments and thinking, okay, what do my students need to learn? What are the program learning outcomes? And how can more digital fluent, more digitally inclusive, crucially, types of assessments that are more conducive to neurodivergent learners, learners with specific learning differences, how can all of this be used in conjunction with racially and culturally and ethnically sensitive content itself? So that's why things like reflective learning diaries, getting students to produce infographics, zines, all of these kinds of things are just as intellectually respectable as a traditional essay. Now, we have one student at SOAS who's planning to do their independent study project on queer art. And we have a gallery section in SOAS, which we can actually hire out and use as the display for their work. So you have the material artifacts there, and then the kind of artist blurb that serves as the kind of reflective commentary. But if you just told that student you have to sit and write a formal dissertation, when they can't do it, they don't have the discursive and psychological architecture for that purpose, you're excluding them from knowledge production, inhibiting them to actually realize their own nature as an epistemic authoritative agent. So in terms of the operational side, and just to conclude on the side of things, this is actually how it worked out. So this is always fun because I get to do my previous life I was an economist, so it's like, ooh, data. What we had was that there was a team of 8 researchers, 4 academic staff, and 4 student interns. We had the student interns were from PPE, social anthropology, world philosophies, and history and international relations. And we met over 14 weeks, beginning in January 2024, finishing in mid-April. And effectively, what we just did is we had a kind of open plan to discussion saying, right, what do we want this thing to comprise? And it was just that. Each one was sharing things. I had this kind of doodle page where I was just throwing ideas around. And then every time we needed to make a collaborative decision, that was what we did. Just put it to the team and say, right, do we get sign off? And ultimately, everything that was produced in both the toolkit and handbook had sign off from all 8. We just automatically said, no, this will not get published until all of us sign off on it. So if it needs to go through multiple changes, it will go through multiple changes. There's no rush. Okay. So this was all, and also crucially, the students were paid. So this is probably the most important point of all. This was not free labor. It wasn't academic staff for their cushy permanent jobs, and then free labor from students who are already paying fees. Students were actually paid to do this. Okay. And this is the kind of sense about how each member of staff was partnered up with a co-creator intern, and we just co-authored things together. So my chapter, the one on assessment, for example, with my wonderful intern, Leslie, that was literally 50-50. And same thing with all of the other chapters. Everything was 50-50. Nothing was dominated by staff. Nothing was dominated by students. It was exactly a collaborative affair, which made it a very beautiful and exciting activity. And we just had a kind of project week check-ins, always just to check, because remember, they were also doing their own studies at the same time. So this was a kind of side project, but they put so much love and effort into it, it made it truly extraordinary as a piece of research. So as I said, the key issue is, why is there so much hostility towards co-creation? Is because it's the kind of last twitches of wanting to control your students. It's the fear that your students will kind of overtake you in power and prestige. But in a way, that's the kind of beauty about almost the parental side of things, is that you want your kids to surpass you in every way. Like I don't want, as a father, my daughter to just say, dad's on this pedestal I can't ever achieve. Like, no, knock me down, push me out of the way, get where you need to go. Okay. And I think that's the kind of last twitches as well of that kind of coloniality mentality, about organizing things, restraining, disciplining, etc. But the key point is that thinking of students from the second they start enrolling as having active stakes in knowledge production, thinking of them, treating them as researchers who are discursive and literate, and who can tap into lived experience as a way of building and creating and reproducing knowledge, rather than thinking of it, as I said earlier, as a barrier to knowledge. So that's it. Thank you.